Hello, good morning and welcome to BBC Learning Zone. Get a feel for modern sculpture in half an hour as the OU takes a look at the work of two controversial American artists, Smithson and Serra. First though to the Tuscan city of Siena for a tour of the medieval Palazzo Pubblico.
The Torre del Mangia is one of the last of the great towers that once filled the skyline of medieval Siena. Beneath it is the Palazzo Pubblico, seat of Sienese government throughout the 14th century. But just what did this huge structure symbolize? Was it a civic fortress representing control over the turbulent affairs of the city? Or was it a municipal palace whose splendor advertised the economic prosperity of Siena? Its actual title, the Palazzo Pubblico, or Public Palace, is somewhat misleading. The building wasn't all palace, and it was certainly not all open to the public. However, it quickly became such a recognizable symbol that it was used, together with the cathedral, to identify the city, as in this fresco by Sano di Pietro. Such visual symbolism made it a conscious focus of secular control. Its stone-crowned tower dominated the principal open space of the city, as well as the surrounding country, marking it out from afar. But what was the function of this public palace, with its tower, its castellated roof, and great open loggia? By the end of the 14th century, the Palazzo Pubblico was obviously recognized as the prime symbol of the Sienese state. And it's worth examining how it came to express that identity and how it functioned as the seat of civil government and the center of political control for both city and state. For example, from here, in this rooftop loggia, the 9 elected leaders could actually look out over the city of Siena and its territory, the Contado, for both of which they were responsible. Immediately below the loggia is the produce market, exactly where it was in the 14th century, literally where the city and countryside meet. But while the back of the palazzo overlooks the agricultural centre and the countryside, the front addresses the city, facing onto the Campo, the public arena designed for civic display. And that, significantly, was paved in 9 segments symbolizing the members of the ruling council. For the whole of the first half of the 14th century, Siena was ruled by a council of 9 governors and defenders of the people and the state. Each group of 9 was elected and lived in some state here in the Palazzo Pubblico. And this loggia, which is a domestic element in the architecture, would have given them some recreation space, because they were forbidden to leave the palazzo for the whole of their 2-month term of office. So it was here, in this building, that they prepared legislation for the Council of the Bell. It was here that they promulgated Siena's new constitution of 1309. And it was they who, some 10 years before that, had initiated the council's order that the Palazzo Pubblico be built, as they put it, for the honor of the Sienese Comune and for the beauty of the city. Looking at the front of the building today, you can analyze the way it expresses its practical and symbolic functions. To start with, you can see that the facade is in 3 sections. The wing on the right has 3 windows, or bays, the central block has 4, and 4 more on the tower make the other wing. The whole facade is remarkable for its consistency and uniformity. Yet behind that facade, there are effectively 3 buildings. Even so, a single pattern of stone arches forms the base for all 3, concealing their different functions and expressing, if you like, a clear consensus. The doorway to the right-hand wing opens directly onto the campo without steps or portico. It served the wing designed to house the 9 elected governors. It was here that they lived for their period of office, and this was the first section to be completed. The interior courtyard is now filled in and the ground floor altered, but the principal floor, the piano nobile, is still marked out by large trifore windows. These are designed with some degree of splendour and were used to set the pattern for palaces in the rest of the city. Each window carries the balzana, the black and white shield of Siena. At the back, the piano nobile has matching trifore windows overlooking the market. But here, because of the sloping site, they appear at a much higher level. The wing of the 9 is on the left, and there, inside on the piano nobile, was the Sala dei Nove, where the 9 met in council. This Chamber of the 9 is painted with frescoes on 3 walls by Ambrogio Lorenzetti that depict allegories of good and bad government and their effect on everyday life. The allegory of good government is a fascinating and detailed expression of a political ideal. The figure of Ben Comune, the good of the state, sits enthroned, dressed in the black and white livery of Siena. About his head hover personifications of 3 Christian virtues: faith, hope, and charity. Faith carries the cross of Christianity. Hope, spes in Latin, looks upward at a vision of Christ. And charity holds the flaming heart, symbol of spiritual love. Beside Ben Comune sit personifications of other virtues. In white is peace, next to fortitude and prudence. On his other side are magnanimity, temperance, and justice. While Ben Comune and his court of virtues are shown on the right of the wall, on the left is another image of justice, this time in action. Wisdom hovers over her head, holding the scales, in each of which is an angel administering justice. From each scale, a thread runs down to be gathered together and twisted in the hand of Concord, who sits below. The twisted cord is then passed along by a group of citizens, surely the merchants, bankers, and scholars of Siena, into the hand of the figure of Ben Comune. The implication is clear. Through the delivery of justice comes the good of the state. This allegory of the process of good government fills the whole end wall. At right angles to it is the corresponding image of bad government, where the central throne is occupied by the figure of a devil, labelled tyranny. His acolytes include the vices, avarice, lean and greed in her greed, and pride, brilliantly robed in red. Although this fresco is badly damaged, it's still possible to make out the effects of bad government in both city and country. The details show marauding soldiers creeping across a darkened countryside. A farmstead is put to the flames. The city is shown with buildings in ruins. Only the armourer is in business. Murder and abduction are committed in the open streets. And above all, the figure of fear flies with a scroll proclaiming that wherever justice is subjected to tyranny, everyone goes in fear of death. By contrast, the wall opposite represents the fruits of good government, and presiding over that is security, with her scroll proclaiming the advantages of a world without fear. And although that security clearly requires severe penalties for wrongdoers, the message is that the benefits are obvious. Beneath her, a hawking party rides out into a prosperous countryside where farmers bring produce to market. The detail is lively, and one almost believes these could be portraits. A fortified town caps a distant hill, suggesting the extent of the peaceful state. The countryside is arranged to show the rewards of agriculture, from harvesting to threshing and finally hunting in the stubble. While half this wall is given over to the abundance of a sunlit countryside, the other half represents the results of good government in a city where the buildings jostle close together and the streets are full of prosperity and harmony. Although these images conjure up an ideal existence, they also depict normal activities of 14th century life. And that this was intended to represent Siena is clearly indicated on the city gate by the reference to Siena's legendary Roman origin, the she-wolf and twins, depicted projecting just as they do from the Palazzo Pubblico itself. In fact, the whole edifice can be seen as a built embodiment of that same concept of good government depicted in the frescoes inside. Peace and justice united with trade and economic success. This can be seen even in the massive cellars beneath the palazzo, which were actually used to store the salt exacted as a tax in kind by the state. Above them, the ground floor, once the treasury, is still used for government offices. The central hall is massively built, with vaults that support the whole structure above. It's a space of some grandeur, fitting for all the bureaucracy of what was one of the most prosperous states in Italy. Although this part still largely resembles its original layout, much of the building has in fact been altered. On the facade, for example, one major addition in the 17th century was an upper floor to each wing. If we electronically remove these, we can see what a difference they make to the original design. Without them, the building has a clear horizontal base that relates to the houses on either side, and the mass of the central tower is greatly exaggerated, increasing its fortress-like appearance. You become even more aware that the stone arcade across the base has few openings and lacks the ceremonial entrance stair that was common in town halls elsewhere. But although this building was successfully defended against the rebel Ptolemei faction in 1318, it wasn't ever in reality a fortress. The arcade openings and the windows are too spacious, and the machicolations at roof level are purely for show, not serious military defence. In other words, there's a decided ambiguity about the style of this building. A fortress exterior that's not really fortified, elements of the public loggia at ground level that are closed, not open, with splendidly palatial windows above. In the central section, on the principal floor, the piano nobile, there were the chambers used for council meetings. Naturally, these were treated to the most splendid decoration, though a number of the original paintings have been covered by later editions. However, we can still see the sort of symbolic imagery that was commissioned for the centrepiece of civil government here in the main council chamber, the Sala de Concilio. For example, the fresco at the top of the wall relates to one of Siena's more glorious military victories. Painted by Simone Martini, it depicts a campaign by the Sienese that took place while the Palazzo Pubblico was being built, and shows the siege of Monte Massi. Simone Martini has included a detailed view of the Sienese camp, with elaborate tents, and even the vineyard that the soldiers planted during the siege. The siege works were substantial. A whole walled castle was built and equipped with catapults. The commander, Guidoriccio da Fogliano, is proudly shown mounted on a horse that's fully caparisoned in his personal livery. He was Siena's Capitano del Guerra in this campaign, and the date, 1328, is carefully recorded on the painted frame beneath. This open celebration of Siena's military and political success had already been established in an earlier fresco. But this is almost as interesting for the way it's defaced. The circular scratches probably result from the mounting on this wall of a revolving wooden map of Siena's surrounding territory made by Ambrogio Lorenzetti in 1334, which has since disappeared. The mixture of self-glorification and function is appropriate for this most public of the great meeting rooms, the Sala di Concilio, where the government controlled the state and ensured its prosperity. But good government, as we have seen, had to be maintained by force if necessary. Law and order was largely in the hands of the Podestà and was dealt with in the third part of the palazzo. For the security of the state, the Podestà had to be a foreigner appointed to serve for a fixed term as captain of police and chief justice of the city. You enter this section directly into a cortile that covers the whole of the ground floor. Here, presumably, petitioners and those with legal business to transact could have waited. But, more importantly, this was also a holding area for armed retainers. As chief enforcement officer, the Podestà had a bodyguard of 40 to 60 men, as well as knights, squires, notaries and judges in his entourage. For that element of government, this enclosed courtyard, as much fortress as palace, is an appropriate setting. Yet it was also a home for the Podestà and his family, who lived here on the Piano Nobile. Once again, we see the palace-style windows that are such a feature of the main facade. In 1330, a rearward extension of the Podestà's wing was built to contain a prison. This is no surprise because law enforcement was central to his role. It was reached by a wide bridge, now filled in underneath. The prison block itself has been extensively altered, but the cells were originally at first floor level, where the tall windows now are. Surprisingly, the upper floors of this massive brick structure were built as the largest meeting room of the whole palazzo, the Sala di Gran Consiglio, capable of holding 500 councillors and as many servants and secretaries. This wing was distinct from the main palazzo and connected only by the bridge. Equally important, though less noticeable, the Podestà wing itself was separated from the central tower. A gap in the crenellations at the back indicates that a single bay doesn't belong to either part of the building. What we see conceals where a narrow passageway once ran between the buildings, starting here where the wooden doors now are. Inside, although this passageway is now broken up with the insertion of modern stairs, you can still see where it once ran between the market square and the campo. So the facade unified the four separate blocks of the building in a recognized language of civic architecture. But there are two further elements: the projecting Cappella di Piazza and the Torre della Mangia. The tower had, of course, a function: to house the bell that rang daily at dawn and for curfew, and to summon the council to meetings. So a campanile was necessary. But that hardly justifies the extreme height of this tower. It rises 87 metres above the Campo and is an impressive piece of structure. Its purpose was simply to raise the stone crown high above the city. The design of this top section was entrusted to the Sienese painter Lippo Memmi, which suggests to me that the appearance was important for this symbolic structure. The building as a whole symbolized the pyramid of power in Siena, whose apex was the Council of Nine. But there's one final link to make. The Palazzo Pubblico symbolizes the wealth of Siena and the strength of her government. It owes its existence to the rule of the Nine. But does it also belong to the life of the city? I think it does, and this is shown in the sixth and final element of the building, the little chapel added at the base of the tower after 1352 in thanksgiving for relief from the Black Death that destroyed 1/3 of the population of the city. At first sight, however, it seems like a complete afterthought and results in a disastrous clash with the windows of the Piano Nobile. But in fact, the whole of the upper part is a late 15th century addition. If we electronically remove the 15th century work, the proportions and the overall effect are completely changed. We can see again how the roof could have fitted with the stone arcade on the ground floor. The chapel itself, built of stone and not brick, is richly carved and decorated with marble inlay. It offers the only really elaborate sculptural element in the whole building. The square piers were set with 12 Gothic niches that were once filled with images of the apostles by Sienese sculptors, a lucrative series of commissions after a time of great hardship. The space was enclosed by low stone screens, these on the sides being reused from the 13th century baptismal font of the cathedral. Thus, this chapel is fully open to the life of the Campo. Although physically joined to the Palazzo Pubblico, it's linked with the city by its reuse of well-known materials and its very origin as a response to communal suffering. In other words, it fulfilled another important part of the civic role of the building, that of religion. As recognized in this painting depicting San Bernardino preaching in the Campo, piety was a part of good government. So, chapel and tower, prison and palazzo, all form one great structure. And, seen as it would have looked when completed, the parts combine to express the power, the economic and political strength of a city that was well aware it deserved such honor and beauty.
Explore the world of pre-Raphaelite art now as Mike Ricketts looks beyond the surface of Millet's classic painting, Ophelia.
he's trying to depict an evocative but also a virtuous kind of world. Millet has gone to some lengths to create a sort of convincing space that we can look into. I think we look through the frame in a sense as though we're looking through a window. And he's also created an extraordinary amount of detail within the painting as well. He bases his painting procedure on a very close observation of nature. For this painting, he spent a long time on the banks of a particular river in Surrey. And then he inserts into this setting, back at the studio, the model that he's using, Elizabeth Siddal, who he dresses in an ancient dress as the character Ophelia. And in order to get the realistic impression of a woman lying in water, surrounded by flowers, he actually has sessions of painting Elizabeth Siddal lying in a bathtub, which he keeps warm with lamps underneath the bathtub itself. And there was one kind of infamous incident where the lamps kind of go out, but Millet, of course, being the sort of genius artist, gets so carried away that he doesn't notice this. Millet ends up under the threat of being sued by her father because she's sort of got some terrible illness as a result of this painting session. The date of the painting is 1852, and yet the scene that we're looking at takes place, if you like, in another time altogether. It looks back in time, if you like, this painting. We could call it a kind of fantasy painting, in terms of the fact that Millet is emphatically not painting modern life as it was in Britain in 1852. He paints another time, another space, and he's creating a world that we can, if you like, escape into. In turning to this other time, if you like, they're trying to turn to a newly pious kind of art, if you like. If we think back to a kind of Victorian mindset, they would see a painting like this in terms of truth to nature, in terms of it being a more honest kind of painting. It's interesting that the image is of a beautiful woman who is basically going mad and is drowning. This, again, is something that we find in a lot of Victorian painting. This particular subject gives Millet an opportunity to paint a woman who has been rejected by her man, by Hamlet, and who basically can't cope without her man. So, logically, of course, the thing to do if you can't cope without your man is to sort of fall to your death, and in a nice picturesque way, with suitable sort of tragedy. And this idea of this image of woman is certainly very much of its time, I think. In being a tragic story, I think this would be also a story to learn by, in a sense. There was a lot of anxiety around, for example, prostitution in Victorian life, and that this was a great kind of moral debate. And this painting kind of sits in a relationship to that kind of moral debate, so that in the context of the Royal Academy setting and the kinds of people, bourgeois and upper class people who would come to see this painting, it would have certain kinds of meanings in relationship to women and their behaviour, if you like.
Test your understanding of modern art on BBC Learning Zone now, as the OU highlights the work of two controversial sculptors.
Liverpool Street is one of the main commuter stations for the City of London. In the 1980s, it was redesigned and incorporated into the Broadgate complex, an extensive and prestigious property development. Broadgate typifies the entrepreneurial drive to develop rundown areas of London's old industries in the name of a multinational, service-oriented economy. The complex makes extensive use of modern art to embellish its corporate image. Yet one of the centre's key sites is dominated by this controversial sculpture, Fulcrum by Richard Serra. Its jarring contrast with the sleek finish of the surrounding architecture is obvious, and it provokes equally contrasting reactions from the commuters.
I come into the station every morning. I work very close by. And frankly, I think it's hideous.
I think it's quite nice, actually. I know a lot of my colleagues don't like it. I think it's got a sort of strength about it. I quite like the way it's going rusty as well.
Given the predictability of this mixed response to an unfamiliar type of work, the question is, what effect did the artist intend to have by installing such a work in such a place? He cannot have been ignorant of the possibility of adverse reactions, for at the very moment when Fulcrum was being erected in London in 1987, another public artwork by Richard Serra was the focus of mounting controversy in New York. Whereas Fulcrum echoes the dimensions of an essentially vertical space, Tilted Arc ran horizontally across the open space of Federal Plaza in New York City's financial and administrative district. It was installed in 1981, but from the mid-80s onwards, a campaign organised by conservative political and legal figures and claiming to draw widespread support from the public began to demand the sculpture's removal. Tilted Arc was finally dismantled by American government agencies on the night of 15th of March, 1989. Richard Serra has said of this type of sculpture that to remove such work from the site it was designed to occupy is to destroy the work. Like Tilted Arc, Fulcrum is a site-specific work. Serra has produced several of these tall, vertical pieces, but each one is adapted to the needs of its particular site, varying, for example, the height or even the number of plates. Fulcrum is made of 5 slabs of Corten steel, and the whole sculpture weighs over 200 tons. Richard Serra explains how the piece was installed.
One of the things that was really interesting about putting this piece up is that there's 5 plates, and basically the procedure is to allow these plates to lean in, and one to lean against the other as you're erecting it, and to hold them in place, and then to lean the 5th one in so that they conclude and lock in. And there's just a little slot in the ground in terms of what the underpinnings need to be. There's enough of weight below, but actually the balance of the piece and the stability of the piece occurs because of the equilibrium of the masses touching against each other. And in order to accomplish that, what we did is we stood the plates up, and then with cables, we hooked them up to the building. And then by hand, we would lower one in, and then we would lower the other one in. And then the crane finally let the 5th one come in, and we held on to it with ropes. It was one of the more exciting installations I've ever done.
There is no doubt that the scale, the unworked nature of the plates, and the rusting surface of these sculptures is problematic for many people. Serra's installation is complex and skillful, but it's not a skill normally associated with art. Likewise, rust, which conventionally signifies neglect. It's easy to overlook the fact that oxidation is a property of Corten steel, which ultimately seals and preserves it. The gradual change it involves from blue-grey to brown, from shiny to matte, is part of a wider interest in time and context, which marked off Serra's generation from previous modernist sculpture.
Probably the underlying glue that held a lot of the new work together at that time was time, the whole idea of time, that you would experience something through walking and looking, through anticipation and memory. Probably the other thing that held it together was context, that if one didn't enter into the context, so to speak, there was no work, because in order to fulfill the content of the work, there had to be a interface, both between the person's ability to experience the context and the work itself, which is very different than the autonomous object, which you can take a photograph of and place in a book. The funny thing about the autonomous object, when you really think about it, you usually think of them in rooms. Because if you take most autonomous objects and you put them out in the landscape, they fail utterly. So there was something about the notion of entering into space in a different way than the autonomous sculpture that had always occupied a pedestal. So most of this work really was involved with entering into, through, and around, which was very different than the autonomous object. You can't walk into it.
Serra was not alone in the 1960s and 70s in developing a new type of sculpture which addressed the question of its place in the world, both physically and ideologically. Just outside the town of Emmen in northern Holland is a sand and gravel quarry. Most of it is still worked, but in a disused part of the quarry, Robert Smithson, an American artist, built Broken Circle, Spiral Hill. The work was his contribution to the Sonsbeek International Festival of 1971. Like Serra, Smithson was critical of modernist notions of the autonomous art object. The other side of this was a curiosity about modern industry and what it was doing to the earth. Smithson was neither an ecologist nor did he expect art to save the world from technology. But he was interested in a form of aesthetic resistance to the technological powers which seemed to dominate the contemporary world. He made drawings for several large earthworks in mines and quarries, which he called land reclamation projects. This one was for a copper mine in America. But Broken Circle Spiral Hill is the only fully fledged example to be realised. Even so, it has changed a lot since 1971. Originally, the hill was covered in a layer of black sand from the quarry, and the spiral path around it was laid out in white sand. This contrasted with the pale yellow sand of the jetty, which cut directly into the greenish-blue water. Now the hill is dark green and brown. Its sharp outlines are blurred by cotoneaster bushes, which have been planted to stabilise it. And the spiral path is covered in wood shavings. The semicircular jetty is now separated from the water by this wooden edging, intended to prevent erosion. The status of these changes is problematic, and since Smithson's early death in 1973, they have been the occasion of much controversy. On the one hand, he certainly approved limited measures to preserve the work, but at the same time, it's unlikely that he wanted the deterioration to be entirely arrested. Erosion and subsidence are continually taking place, and as such are part of the work. Smithson was interested in this return to undifferentiated matter, a process which he describes as entropy. For him, it underlined the inescapable processes of decay, which no amount of technology at a civilization's disposal can ever finally defeat. In this sense, perhaps, his earthworks can be read as a kind of vanitas, or memento mori. The inexorability of material processes, of geological time spans, which render human culture, let alone modern art, minuscule, form a continuing undercurrent in Smithson's sculpture. The choice of this quarry is particularly telling, for it only exists here at all because of the extraordinary nature of the terrain. A mixture of different sands and gravels, it is the terminal moraine of a glacier in the last ice age. Smithson's interest in the quarry marks the re-emergence of a perception which has been a leitmotif of the modern in art. A perception of the proximity of the modern and the ancient, of progress and decay. For Smithson, the machine was no more important than the earth it moved. Steel was no more important than rust. Modernist art seemed to him to be too refined, in fact too confined by its preoccupation with autonomy. For him, art had to confront the abyss which lay behind modern civilization. It had to go into places where remote futures meet remote pasts. The stone at the heart of Broken Circle Spiral Hill is a case in point. This boulder has a curious history in Smithson's work. It's been lying here ever since it was dropped by the glacier thousands of years ago. But Smithson's original idea was for the conical hill to look down on a purely flat circular jetty, so he was going to have the boulder removed. But it turned out to weigh so much that they had no equipment that was powerful enough to do this. There was even talk at one stage of involving the Dutch army, but that idea seems to have come to nothing. And anyway, as the work went on, Smithson's feelings for the stone were changing. Instead of wanting to have it taken away, he came to see it as the centre, the pivot around which everything else revolved. In his imagination, it began to take on the properties of a looming presence. He called it a glacial heart of darkness, a warning from the Ice Age. Smithson was intrigued by the boulder's similarity to other large stones which guard the entrance to the Hun's Bed, a local Bronze Age burial chamber. Time is written into the sculpture at various levels then. There is this inexorable, entropic, geological time. There is also the circular time of the seasons. And a third kind of time is involved, hours. Smithson's work, like Serra's, demands that the viewer perceive it by entering into it. We only fully experience the broken circle from the spiral hill. Conversely, we best apprehend the hill from the circle. The key thought underpinning this is that human perception and human experience are embodied. As with Serra's sculpture, we begin to experience Broken Circle Spiral Hill only as we move through it and around it. Smithson rejected modernist art with its forgetfulness of context and its requirement to imaginatively transcend all bodily and social constraint. It seemed to be in danger of defaulting on its emancipatory promise. Its failure lay in its disregard of these material factors and the idealism that involved. Smithson believed it was better to disclose the reality of confinement than to peddle illusions of freedom. Smithson and Serra were, of course, independent artists. Nonetheless, they were involved in a common cause, challenging modernist sculptural conventions. This is the Kröller-Müller Sculpture Park, also in Holland. Serra installed a site-specific work here in 1973. Serra called this work Spin Out, and he subtitled it For Robert Smithson, who had been killed in a plane crash a few months earlier. Clearly, though, it isn't a monument in any conventional sense. It doesn't depict him or anything like that. So beyond that mere fact of the title, is there any connection that we can make between this piece and Smithson's own outdoor work, such as the Broken Circle? Let's look first in more detail at Spin Out itself. Whereas Smithson tended to work with the materials of a particular site, Serra has obviously imported his material, Corten steel again. But once more, there is an emphasis on the specifics of place not to be found in conventional modernist sculpture. The 3 steel plates are set into the sides of an elliptical valley. Each plate is 10 feet high and 40 feet long. The triangular space implied by the ends of the plates is 152 feet on its long side and 78 feet on each shorter one. That's the geometry. But as one moves through the glade, all these angles, sizes and dimensions seem to change with the spectator's point of view. Shifting and surprisingly dynamic relationships are set up between the pieces of metal and the spaces and the gradients of the glade they occupy. As with Smithson's work, the experience of moving through the piece, of viewing it from different angles and heights in relation to the locomotion of one's own body, is central. This is unlike previous modernist sculpture, where all the dimensions, the angles, the metal itself were transmuted into the imaginative world of the artwork. Here the artwork is in our world, a physical thing and a set of relationships between physical things, of which our experience is palpably embodied. And what of the material itself? Spinout is made of Corten steel, like fulcrum, although this is a slightly thinner plate. And because it's been exposed to the air for so much longer, this relatively shiny slate-coloured skin that Corten steel has when it's new, and which is still clearly visible on fulcrum, has here almost completely oxidised away to leave this heavy, matte, brown surface. However, neither the texture nor the colour is uniform throughout. The weathering process is still taking place, and according to the prevailing wind and the action of sunlight and rain, different faces reveal widely different aspects. The effect of climatic conditions upon the work is nowhere more evident than in the lichens which have in places grown on the steel, and in the thick green deposits down below. At different times of the year, the play of light falling through the leaves can almost dissolve the huge steel blades. Thus, the character of the work is continually being reformed in the dialectic of the steel and its site. As Serra says,
the landscape pieces tend to be more about anticipation, memory, reverie, maybe more lyrical in some sense. They may even be the most abstract aspect of my work, I don't know.
Can we notice any formal similarities between Serra's Spinout and Smithson's Broken Circle Spiral Hill?
I didn't think specifically of Smithson when I was doing the piece in the Kroller-Müller. I was trying to extend how I wanted to deal with steel in the landscape in relation to my own work. But for me to say that I wasn't influenced early on by Bob Smithson is a complete falsehood. I mean, I was absolutely close to him in a way where I couldn't help but be influenced by him. And after he died, there was a point where I thought about him every day.
Perhaps it's worth recognising a very basic point about the terrains that both Serra and Smithson have used. Although the glade here is natural, whereas the quarry is man-made, both offer more of a possibility of overview, of contrasting plans and elevations, than is common in an overwhelmingly flat country like Holland. In Smithson's work, the broken circle tends to read clockwise, and the suggested motion can be seen as centrifugal, outwards from the stone. The path to the top of the hill, on the other hand, spirals inwards in a contracting centripetal motion. It's significant that Serra has observed of his own piece that when it's viewed from ground level as one enters the glade, the effect is of a movement outwards by the plates. Yet, when viewed from above, the effect is one of contraction, of movement inwards towards the centre. Both Broken Circle, Spiral Hill and Spin Out have had a positive public reception. The owners of the quarry, the De Boer family, and the local arts administrators have preserved Smithson's unique work at Emmen. And here too at Colamulla, Serra's sculpture arouses interested discussion as well as more solitary exploration. Yet the insertion of site-specific work into urban public spaces, as we've already seen, has been a more controversial issue. Rusting steel and geometric shapes can appear picturesque in the countryside, but in the city, features beyond the merely physical and perceptual come inescapably onto the agenda. People's conventional expectations of public art and the nature of their environment are brought to the fore. The political and economic interests structuring that environment are also forced into consideration. To the extent that these works engage with power, they tread a dangerous line. A line between alerting people to the norms, values and mechanisms of power in which their lives are enmeshed, and that of becoming one more aspect of that power. Serra is in no doubt about the stakes involved. His urban, site-specific sculptures are not meant to sit comfortably in their locations. They are meant to pose a challenge to them, to the conventions of the architecture, and not least to the ideologies that sustain what goes on inside that architecture.
I'm not a big fan of this architecture, and I actually think that my work, in some sense, exposes the facade of a lot of the architecture. On the other hand, in urban environments, you can't help but expose, to some degree, what's there. There's always an ideological overtone of the frame, and that's, you always have to contend with it, and you can't escape it. I think often what happens is work has to resist the maelstrom of storm or whatever, to take place in the context. Children growing up with work immediately understand, oh, that's the sculpture that I grew up with. They have no problem with it. Older people who think that they know something about what conventions ought to be can be thoughtlessly critical. But I think one of the things that's interesting about art is that it gives you an experience that nothing else can in a diversity of ways, and you can continually go back to it to understand your own relation to the world. As small as that sounds, or as insignificant as it sounds, we don't have much else. There's not much else that gives us the ability to grow in the way that art does.
Nightlife gets a whole new meaning now in BBC Learning Zone as cyber art goes clubbing.
When we started working in multimedia, one of the most interesting areas to work in was education. With Dancer DNA, I think we stumbled upon an extension of multimedia into potentially much larger audiences. Music and visuals are going to come together. I think it's part of the dynamic of the increasing use of computers. Dancer DNA can be projected very effectively onto large screens at live events. It takes perhaps a feed from the music desk or from the DJ's desk, and then generates animations that are thrown up in real time. There's based on a form of programming known as artificial life programming, which uses evolutionary theory as a model. What Dancer DNA does is to evolve computer programs. So when you ask the program to mutate a shape, what it's effectively doing is generating perhaps 10, perhaps 15 new computer programs which can then generate more shapes. Me and my brother look pretty different, but there are all sorts of other brothers that could have existed between us, one of which would be very, very similar to me. There'd be another one very similar to my brother, but a little closer to me. And the same happens in Dancer DNA. You can generate two shapes, and then the software will effectively interpolate all the possible shapes in between those shapes by looking at the genetic descriptions and saying, well, this gene is slightly different in creature 1 than it is in creature 2, so we'll create a creature that's halfway between them. Various channels it's taken from the music are then being used to set events that generate this animation by analysing the music. My sense of beauty will determine what survives on my computer when I'm working with Dancer DNA, because shapes that I find ugly, I'm just going to allow to die off. Shapes I find beautiful, I'm going to start searching to see whether certain beautiful features are actually improving over the generations or slowly getting lost. The software resembles a word processing package insofar as it's got documents which you can open and you can cut and paste between. The only difference is that these are populations and they contain creatures that can evolve and then generate animations from. I can select one of these shapes, and then if I set the mutation rate very low, well, there's just a series of perhaps small changes. But if I set the mutation rate very high, then the change becomes much more radical and will now be used to generate completely new animation. The animation is also thrown up the screen through the music, and that could be any kind of source, no matter of playing the CD and sending the animation live. The attraction of using the club scene was that it's an area where music is the most important, and it's where people are deeply involved in what they're hearing, dancing to it. And Dancer DNA is the same. It's using that music to generate a new experience. And so we wanted to try and reach people who were already immersed in the experience and try and take it a little bit further. The reaction from the clubs has been fantastic. I don't think anyone's seen graphics like this produced in a club. To see the images that you're seeing and the sounds that you're hearing responding so tightly together, I think is an entirely new experience for many people.